Welcome to Silent Secrets, a place where every quiet corner hides a story, every shadow whispers a secret, and every mystery is waiting for you to uncover it. Grab a seat, stay a while, and let the secrets begin.
Chapter 1. The mansion that smiled too wide. The mansion sat uphill with the calm arrogance of old money, an object that did not merely occupy space but claimed it. From the town below, its windows looked like a string of golden teeth, bright against the winter dark. The road that climbed to it wound between bare trees and silent hedges, as if reluctant to admit anyone to such intimacy. Even the snow seemed different here, less like weather than decoration, sprinkled to flatter stonework and iron gates. Rosevear House did not welcome it displayed. Captain Hastings, stamping his boots at the foot of the steps, lifted his face into the wind and laughed softly. "Poirot, you must admit, there is something splendid about it." Hercule Poirot did not look up at the glowing effort with admiration. He looked at the steps. They were heated. One could see it from the faint wet sheen where snow melted at the edges. A convenience for guests, certainly. And also an announcement: we do not slip. We do not stumble. We do not show weakness. "Splendid," he said mildly, "is sometimes a synonym for excessive." Hastings blinked. "Excessive, my dear fellow, it's Christmas." Poirot adjusted the fall of his scarf with care, his gloved fingers moving like a man straightening the world into correctness. "Yes," he replied, "and so everyone feels obliged to behave as though they are kind." They were admitted at once. The doors opened with smooth speed, as if the house had been waiting for them specifically, and warmth rolled outward in a scented wave. Pine, spiced citrus, beeswax, and something sharper beneath it, like the lingering memory of expensive perfume. Inside, the party glittered. It was not the honest glitter of joy, but the cultivated kind. Chandeliers bright enough to make you forget the dark, gold-rimmed glasses lifted with practiced ease, velvet drapes heavy as theater curtains. A string quartet played carols at a volume designed not to interrupt conversation, only to polish it. Laughter rose and fell in neat arcs. Poirot paused just inside the hall. His gaze moved without hurry, taking in the arrangement of people as one might take in a painting. Who stood where, who drifted near whom, and who was placed deliberately at a distance. He observed the servants first, quiet, precise, almost invisible. Then the guests, faces shining with hospitality or with something that merely resembled it. A young woman in silver stood near the staircase, smiling too brightly at a man who kept glancing at his watch. A banker, Poirot could tell by the hands, clean and confident, held court near the fireplace, talking louder than anyone else, as though the sound of his voice were a form of ownership. Near the far wall, a thin gentleman with hollow cheeks watched the room with a fixed expression of amusement that never touched his eyes. Poirot's attention lingered on him. "Come," Hastings murmured, "let us find the host." They found him at the center of everything, as hosts often must be. Alistair Grafton stood beneath the largest chandelier, a tall man with a handsome face and the relaxed certainty of someone accustomed to being admired. His hair was silver at the temples, his tuxedo flawless. He held a glass of champagne and spoke to his guests with the easy charm of a man who believed himself generous. Yet Poirot noticed something else. Each time Grafton smiled, a small muscle near his jaw tightened as though the smile required effort. His eyes moved constantly, not in enjoyment but in calculation, assessing which guest required his attention and which could be left unattended. Grafton saw Poirot at once. He broke away from his circle with practiced warmth. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings? A great pleasure, truly." He shook Hastings's hand with enthusiasm, then offered Poirot his own with slightly less conviction. Poirot accepted. His handshake was brief. "I have heard," Grafton continued, "that you are in the area for the holidays. I told myself, if I have the fortune to see you, I must insist you come. This house, this evening, my guests, everything is at your disposal." Poirot inclined his head politely. "A house is never entirely at one's disposal, monsieur. It contains too many rooms." Grafton laughed, uncertain whether it was a compliment or a joke. "Ah, you have that famous way." Hastings beamed. Poirot always has a way. Drinks, Grafton offered. Food. We have a chef from London. Truffles, oysters, a ridiculous dessert shaped like the town church. My little joke. I will take only what I can observe. Grafton's laughter tightened. Observe away, monsieur. In my house, there are no secrets. Poirot's eyes rested on him calmly. That is an ambitious statement. Before Grafton could reply, a woman approached, elegant, composed, and very pale. She wore black velvet, which was unusual in a room of holiday colors. Her diamond earrings flashed with every movement, bright as frost. "Alastair," she said quietly. Grafton turned. His smile became fractionally more forced. "My wife, Celeste." Celeste. Grafton nodded to Hastings, then to Poirot. "Monsieur Poirot," she said. Her voice was controlled, as though she kept it on a leash. Poirot bowed slightly. "Madam." Her eyes held his for a moment longer than courtesy required. Poirot saw what lay behind them. Not fear, exactly. Weariness. The kind of fatigue that does not come from a late night, but from living too long inside a performance. Celeste's gaze flicked briefly to the grand staircase, where the house's central clock was visible on the landing above. Its face was enormous, set in carved oak, the numerals gilded. It dominated the hall as a monarch dominates a court. Poirot followed her glance. A clock, he reflected, is a device that pretends to measure time while actually controlling it. "Midnight," Hastings said cheerfully. "Will be a great occasion, I suppose." The toast? Grafton's smile widened. "Too wide. Naturally, we do it properly here." Celeste's hand rose to her throat, then lowered again. A gesture so small it might have been nothing, but Poirot noticed it. He took a champagne flute from a passing tray, not to drink but to hold. The glass was cold, the bubbles rising like obedient secrets. Across the room, the thin gentleman with hollow cheeks watched the staircase clock without blinking. Near the fireplace, the banker's laughter grew louder, but his eyes kept darting toward Grafton. The woman in silver, still smiling, pressed her fingers into the arm of the man beside her hard enough to leave a mark. The air, Poirot realized, was crowded with unspoken things. Hastings leaned toward him. "It's a lively house, quite a crowd." "You're not thinking," Poirot did not answer. He was watching the servants now. One of them, a young man with dark hair and a face trained into respectful blankness, moved through the guests carrying a tray, yet his eyes, though lowered, were not unfocused. They tracked the room with quick, precise glances. A trained watcher, Poirot thought, or a frightened one. At 11:30, the quartet shifted into a quieter carol, as though preparing the room for sentiment. Guests drifted nearer the staircase without acknowledging that they did so. Glasses were refilled more frequently. Smiles became brighter and more brittle. Poirot moved slightly, positioning himself where he could see the staircase clock and the host simultaneously. At 5 minutes to midnight, Grafton ascended the first few steps, turning to face his guests in a pose of practiced benevolence. A servant handed him a fresh glass of champagne. Grafton raised it, waiting. The crowd obeyed the cue, conversations faded, bodies aligned toward him. Even the quartet lowered their bows. The grand clock loomed above Grafton's head like a crown. The first strike came deep, resonant, vibrating through wood and bone. 1, 2, 3. Poirot watched faces. At 7, someone exhaled sharply. At 10, Celeste's hand tightened around her glass until Poirot thought it might crack. 11:12. There should have been silence then, a neat conclusion, a satisfying stop. Instead, the clock struck again. 13. The sound cut through the air like something obscene. A ripple passed through the guests. A startled laugh here, a confused murmur there. Grafton's smile faltered. His eyes lifted toward the clock with an expression that was not surprise, but alarm, as though he had expected many things tonight, but not that. Poirot felt Hastings stiffen beside him. 13, Hastings whispered. "But that's impossible." Poirot did not reply. His attention was fixed on the host. Grafton's hand trembled. He tried to speak, but no words came. His lips parted slightly, as if to call out. Then a scream tore through the hall. It came from the left, high, sharp, immediate. A woman's voice, pure terror. Every head turned. In that instant, the moment when the room's attention fractured, Alistair Grafton swayed. His glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the step. Champagne sprayed across polished wood like spilled gold. Grafton's eyes widened. He clutched at his chest, at his throat, as though trying to pull something out of himself. And then he dropped, not gracefully, not slowly. He fell as though his strings had been cut. Guests surged forward. Someone shouted for a doctor. The quartet froze mid. Note, bows hovering. The warm, glittering world of Rosevear House cracked open, revealing the dark beneath. Poirot moved first. He mounted the steps with quick, precise motion, kneeling beside Grafton's body. The host's eyes stared upward, unfocused. His breathing was shallow, irregular. Foam gathered faintly at the corner of his mouth. Poirot leaned closer and inhaled gently. A bitter, chemical tang clung to the air near Grafton's lips, almost masked by champagne, pine perfume, and panic. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Stand back," he said calmly, and the authority in his voice made people obey before they realized they had. Hastings hovered, shaken. "Poirot, is he?" "Not dead," Poirot said quietly. "Not yet." Celeste Grafton stood 2 steps above her fallen husband, perfectly still. Her glass remained in her hand, untouched. Her face was pale, but her eyes were dry. Poirot looked up at her. For an instant, their gazes met. In her expression he saw not shock, not grief, but something more complicated. Recognition, as though the night had finally arrived at the place she had feared it would reach. A man pushed through the crowd then, tall, broad, shouldered, wearing a dark overcoat, despite the warmth. He had the brisk authority of someone accustomed to command. His eyes were sharp, restless, cutting across the scene with quick intelligence. "Move aside," he said. "I'm with the police." Poirot rose slowly. "You are Detective Harrow." The man snapped, flashing a badge. "Local jurisdiction. Who are you?" Poirot regarded him mildly. "Hercule Poirot." For a fraction of a second, Harrow's expression shifted. Surprise, recalibration, then reluctant respect. "Well," Harrow said, lowering his voice. "Then I suppose this evening just became more complicated." Poirot glanced once more toward the staircase clock. 13. It still showed midnight, its hands steady, as though the extra strike had been nothing more than a flourish. Poirot's gaze returned to the shattered glass on the step, to the host's slack hand, to the faces pressed close with fear and fascination. "This mansion," Poirot murmured, almost to himself, "smiles too wide." And in the warm glitter of Rosevear House, amid carols and champagne and suddenly broken time, Poirot knew with absolute certainty that the holiday celebration had only begun to reveal its true purpose. Chapter 2. 13 isn't a number. It's a message. The hall had changed its temperature. No one remarked upon it aloud, but everyone felt it. The warmth that had once rolled generously through Rosevear House now seemed to hesitate, as though uncertain whether it was still welcome. The chandeliers burned just as brightly, the garlands still draped the banisters, and yet the air had acquired a thin metallic edge that no amount of candlelight could soften. Alistair Grafton lay where he had fallen, his body positioned unnaturally close to the foot of the staircase, almost directly beneath the great clock. One arm rested at an awkward angle, fingers curled as though still grasping for something he had failed to reach. The shattered champagne glass glittered beside him, catching the light like fragments of ice. To Poirot's practiced eye, nothing about the scene was accidental. "Don't move him," Detective Harrow said sharply, holding up a hand as too well, meaning guests attempted to step closer. "Nobody touches anything." Poirot had already risen from his kneeling position. He stood slightly apart now, his posture relaxed, his hands folded lightly before him, observing not the body but the room. Panic was beginning to organize itself into clusters, whispered speculation near the fireplace. A tight knot of guests pressed against the far wall. Celeste Grafton still standing on the staircase, like a carved figure, unmoving and unreadable. "Doctor's on the way," Harrow muttered, though his tone suggested he had little faith one would be of use. Poirot turned his attention upward. The clock dominated the space above the staircase. Oak, framed, elaborate, its gilded numerals gleaming with almost aggressive cheerfulness. The hands were perfectly still now, pointing decisively at midnight. 12, yet everyone in the room knew what they had heard. Harrow stepped closer to the clock, craning his neck. "You're telling me that thing just struck 13? A murmur rippled through the guests. "It did," said the woman in silver, her voice brittle. "I counted. So did I." Another guest added quickly. "Clear as anything." Harrow frowned. "That's not possible." Poirot spoke calmly. "And yet, Inspector, impossibilities occur with remarkable frequency when they are arranged in advance." Harrow shot him a look. "You saying the clock's rigged?" "I am saying," Poirot replied, "that clocks, like people, can be persuaded to behave improperly." Harrow grunted and stepped back, rubbing his jaw. "All right. First things first, no sign of a struggle, no weapon, no one rushed the stairs." "That," Poirot said mildly, "depends on how one defines a weapon." Harrow knelt briefly beside Grafton, careful not to disturb anything. "Fall looks clean, no blood, no obvious trauma. Man just went." Poirot leaned closer, not to the body, but to the space around it. The scent he had detected earlier lingered faintly, already fading beneath the heavy perfumes and spilt champagne. "Death," Poirot said quietly, "is rarely so considerate as to announce itself without preparation." Harrow rose. "Poison, yes. You certain?" Poirot met his gaze steadily. "I would stake my reputation upon it." Harrow exhaled slowly. Then whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. "Indeed," Poirot replied, and wished it to appear effortless. Harrow straightened and surveyed the room. "All right, everyone stays put. This house is now a crime scene." A protest began almost immediately. Complaints about cold, about schedules, about the absurdity of being detained during a holiday gathering. Harrow silenced them with a look. "Believe me," he said flatly, "this is not the evening to test my patience." Poirot moved quietly to the base of the staircase. He studied the exact position of the body in relation to the clock above, the angle of the fall, the way Grafton's head had come to rest slightly turned, as though he had seen something just before he collapsed. A message, Poirot thought, not merely murder, but placement. He glanced up again at the clock. "Inspector," Poirot said, "may I?" Harrow hesitated, then stepped aside. "Be my guest." Poirot ascended 2 steps, stopping directly beneath the clock face. He examined it closely now, his eyes tracing the carved details, the polished brass, the faint wear around the rim. Then he did something unexpected. He took out his pocket watch. It was an unassuming thing, plain, reliable, utterly unlike the theatrical timepiece above him. He flipped it open, checked the time, then checked it again. Poirot frowned slightly. Harrow noticed something wrong. "Yes," Poirot said, "this clock is lying." Harrow crossed his arms. "You just said it struck 13. "Yes, and now it insists it is midnight." "That's how clocks work," Harrow said dryly. "They strike, then settle." Poirot shook his head. "Number this one has been adjusted," he pointed delicately. "Observe the hands. They align too precisely, a fraction of a degree too far forward." Harrow squinted. "You're saying it's off?" "By nearly 7 minutes," Poirot replied. A hush fell. "That's impossible," someone whispered. Poirot turned slightly, addressing the room. "Not impossible, intentional." Harrow frowned. "Why would anyone do that?" Poirot's gaze swept the gathered guests. "Because time, Inspector, is the most persuasive alibi of all." A man near the back cleared his throat nervously. Excuse me," Poirot turned. "Yes, monsieur." The man shifted, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't know if it matters, But I heard something before the scream. Harrow's head snapped up. What kind of something? A ticking, the man said. Not the clock. Lower, like it was under the floor. A ripple of unease spread instantly. Under the floor? Harrow repeated. What are you talking about? I thought it was pipes, the man said quickly, or the heating. But it was, regular, faster than the clock upstairs. Poirot's eyes sharpened. A second ticking, Poirot murmured. Ah. Harrow looked at him sharply. You were expecting that reaction. Poirot inclined his head. I was hoping for confirmation. He gestured toward the staircase. Inspector, Rosevear House is not merely decorated for the holidays, it is engineered. Harrow snorted. Engineered for what? A dramatic death. For anticipation. Poirot replied. For control. Celeste Grafton spoke at last. Her voice was steady, though it carried a strain like wire pulled too tight. That clock has been serviced recently, she said. Poirot turned toward her. By whom? Celeste hesitated. My husband insisted on a specialist, someone discreet. Harrow scribbled in his notebook. Name. I don't know it, Celeste said. Alastair handled everything himself. Poirot studied her carefully. And did you hear the extra strike? Yes, she said. I did. Did it surprise you? Her lips parted slightly, then closed again. No, she said after a pause. It frightened me. Poirot nodded slowly. Harrow looked between them. You two mind telling me why this feels like I've walked into the middle of a play? Poirot's expression was calm, but his eyes were intent. Because you have, Inspector. He gestured subtly toward the clock, the body, the gathered guests frozen in their holiday finery. This was not an impulsive act, Poirot continued. It was timed, framed, announced. Announced, Harrow echoed. Yes, Poirot said softly. 13 is not a number here. It is a signal. Harrow rubbed his face. A signal for what? Poirot looked around the room once more, taking in the tense faces, the locked smiles, the careful silences. For the beginning, Poirot said, not the end. A faint creak sounded beneath their feet, a settling of old wood, perhaps, or something else entirely. The house seemed to listen. Poirot folded his hands behind his back. This mansion, he said quietly, is not celebrating Christmas. Harrow met his gaze. It is counting down. And as the guests stood shivering beneath garlands and lights that suddenly felt obscene in their cheer, the great clock above them ticked on in false confidence, while somewhere beneath the floorboards, something else marked time far more honestly. Chapter 3. The guests with polite teeth. Detective Harrow did not question the room so much as stalk it. He moved in a slow, irregular circle around the fallen host, his boots whispering over polished floors, his eyes sharp and restless. He reminded Poirot of a street cat that has found spilled milk in an unfamiliar alley, alert, suspicious, aware that indulgence might conceal danger. Harrow did not rush his questions. He let his presence do the work first. Poirot watched him with interest. The guests had arranged themselves instinctively, without instruction. Those who felt safest clustered together near the fireplace. Those who feared scrutiny drifted toward the edges of the room. A few stood quite still, as though movement itself might betray them. Polite teeth everywhere, Poirot thought, smiles bared like ornaments. Harrow stopped first before a man in his early 40s, impeccably dressed, hair parted with deliberate neatness. This was Martin Hale, Alastair Grafton's senior business partner, a man whose prosperity clung to him like a tailored second skin. Mr. Hale, Harrow said. You were standing near the host when he collapsed. Hale smiled instantly, too instantly. That's right. Terrible shock, just terrible. Did you see him drink anything unusual? No, just champagne, same as the rest of us. Hale laughed softly, as if embarrassed by the question. Hardly lethal, is it? Poirot noticed how Hale's eyes never once strayed to the body. Harrow leaned closer. You weren't surprised by the extra chime? Hale blinked. Surprised? Well, yes, of course. Clock's malfunction, especially old ones. Yes, Poirot said mildly from nearby. But people rarely do so on cue. Hale's smile flickered. I beg your pardon. Poirot inclined his head. Nothing, monsieur. Please continue. Harrow studied Hale another second, then moved on. Near the banister stood a woman who bore a clear familial resemblance to the fallen host. She was younger than Grafton, perhaps by a decade, her black dress severe, her posture rigid. This was Lydia Grafton, his sister. She had not once looked at the body. Miss Grafton, Harrow said, you're Alastair's next of kin. Yes, she replied evenly. You seem very composed. I've had practice, she said. My brother enjoyed dramatics. This is merely the final one. Harrow raised an eyebrow. You don't wish to approach him? She shook her head. I prefer to remember him standing. Poirot studied her carefully. Her calm was not feigned. It was controlled. There was grief here, but it had been disciplined into something almost elegant. Madam, Poirot asked gently, did you notice anything unusual about the clock before midnight? Lydia's gaze lifted at once, to the clock, not to Poirot. It has always been temperamental. Temperamental, Poirot echoed. Yes, it gains time in the cold, loses it in the heat. My brother used to say it had moods. Poirot nodded slowly. And did it ever strike 13 before? No, she said firmly. Never. Harrow scribbled something and moved on. The caretaker was next. He stood near the edge of the room, hat clutched in his hands, his shoulders hunched, as though expecting to be blamed for the weather. His name was Edgar Finch, a thin man with rough hands and the nervous habit of swallowing before he spoke. Mr. Finch, Harrow said, you're responsible for the maintenance of the house. Yes, sir. And the clock? Finch hesitated. It acts up. How? Harrow asked. Every winter, Finch said quickly, like clockwork. You might say. Cold gets into the gears, makes it unpredictable. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Unpredictable in what way? Finch shifted his weight. Runs fast, runs slow, needs adjusting. Who adjusts it? Poirot asked. The specialist usually, and recently, Poirot pressed. Finch hesitated longer this time. Mr. Grafton asked me not to interfere this season. Did he explain why? Harrow demanded. No, sir. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. A wise instruction, if one wished a clock to misbehave consistently. Finch's eyes widened slightly, but he said nothing. Harrow continued his circuit. Near the far wall, partially obscured by a decorative screen, stood a guest Poirot had not yet spoken to. A quiet figure, neither prominent nor invisible. A woman in a plain, dark coat, Evelyn Bell. Her hair pulled back simply, her face pale but intent. She clutched a small gift box to her chest with both hands. It was wrapped neatly in silver paper, tied with a red ribbon. Harrow stopped before her. Miss. She flinched slightly. Yes? You're holding that rather tightly. Her fingers tightened further. It's fragile. Poirot stepped closer. May I ask whom it is for? She hesitated. For Mr. Grafton. A silence followed. Poirot's voice was gentle. Then you will not have the opportunity to give it. Her lips trembled. Number. And yet you hold it as though it were necessary. Poirot continued softly. As though letting it go would be dangerous. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not release the box. Harrow watched closely. Did you know the host well? She nodded. Too well. Did you see him drink from his glass? Harrow asked. Yes. Did you touch it? Number Poirot observed her hands. They were bare, clean, trembling. Miss, Poirot said, what is inside the box? She swallowed. A watch. Poirot's eyebrows lifted slightly. A watch. Yes, she whispered. He asked for it. Said he wanted something accurate. Poirot exchanged a brief glance with Harrow. Time again, Harrow muttered. The woman clutched the box tighter. I didn't poison him, she said suddenly. I swear it. Poirot inclined his head. I did not accuse you. Harrow stepped back, allowing her space. As the questioning continued, a pattern emerged, not of guilt, but of polish. Every answer was reasonable, every reaction appropriate. No one panicked excessively. No one confessed too readily. No one behaved like a villain. Everybody had clean hands. Poirot stood near the staircase again, gazing at the clock, listening to the low murmur of voices. Beneath it all, he thought he could almost hear that second ticking again, faint, persistent, like a thought one tries unsuccessfully to ignore. He leaned slightly toward Harrow. "Inspector," Poirot said quietly, "do you see it?" Harrow didn't look at him. "See what?" "The gloves," Poirot replied. Harrow frowned. "I don't see any gloves." Poirot smiled faintly. "Exactly." He gestured subtly toward the guests. "Everyone here has touched nothing, seen nothing, done nothing. Their hands are immaculate." Harrow's eyes narrowed. "You think someone planned it so no one would have to get their hands dirty?" "Yes," Poirot said, "or so that the one who did could do so invisibly." Harrow looked around the room again. The smiling partner, the calm sister, the evasive caretaker, the trembling woman with the gift. "Everybody's too clean," Harrow muttered. Poirot nodded. "And when everyone insists they touch nothing, it means someone touched everything." The clock above them ticked on, serene and false. Somewhere beneath the floorboards, something answered it. And Rosevear House, still draped in holiday finery, continued to bare its polite teeth, while counting down with quiet precision to whatever truth it had been built to hide. Chapter 4. The clock's secret throat. The clock did not like being opened. That was Poirot's first impression. Not mystical, not fanciful, but practical. Rosevear House resisted inquiry the way certain people do, politely at first. Then, with quiet stubbornness once pressed, when Detective Harrow ordered the ladder brought and the guests ushered back, the mansion seemed to draw in upon itself, the air tightening as though secrets required oxygen to survive. The ladder was placed carefully against the banister beneath the great clock. Its oak case loomed larger up close, carved vines and holly leaves winding around the frame in seasonal excess. From a distance, it had been festive. From here, it was oppressive. A family heirloom, Lydia Grafton said from behind the cordon Harrow, had established, older than the house itself. "Then it's had plenty of time to learn bad habits," Harrow replied. Poirot stood slightly apart, hands folded behind his back, eyes lifted. He was listening, not to the room but to the clock. It ticked steady, confident, convincing, and wrong. Harrow climbed the ladder himself, rejecting assistance. He opened the small rear panel with a screwdriver, the screws protesting faintly before giving way. As the panel swung open, the ticking changed. Not louder, but uneven. A breath caught mid-cycle. Poirot's head tilted almost imperceptibly. "There," he murmured. Harrow froze. "What?" "The clock," Poirot said. "It is breathing." Harrow snorted. "Clocks don't breathe." "No," Poirot agreed, "but they inhale effort and exhale motion. This one is asthmatic." Harrow peered inside, his expression shifting from irritation to concentration. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. Inside the case, the expected mechanism sat proudly in place. Brass gears, pendulum rod, escapement wheel, all polished, well-maintained, traditional. That was the clock. Everyone saw, behind it, partially concealed by a false backing panel, was something else entirely. A second mechanism, smaller, cruder, modern. "Well," Harrow said slowly, "that explains a few things." Poirot ascended the ladder one step, careful not to intrude too much. He studied the hidden assembly with keen interest. "Two mechanisms," Poirot said. "One official, one parasitic." Harrow nodded. Like a lie taped onto truth. The hidden device was mounted with deliberate care. It did not replace the original mechanism, it complemented it, fed off it. A secondary gear train connected subtly to the main drive, its teeth engaging only at specific intervals. Poirot's eyes moved to the chime assembly. "Inspector," he said, "the rod." Harrow followed his gaze, one of the original brass chime rods, thin, delicate, tuned for resonance, had been snapped cleanly near its base. In its place hung something heavier, a short steel rod, dull and solid, attached with a screw that was far too new to belong. That, Harrow said quietly, wouldn't sound like a normal chime. No, Poirot replied. It would sound emphatic. Harrow reached out, hesitated, then gently tapped the steel rod with his knuckle. The sound that answered was deep, blunt, almost funereal. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. 13, he said. Harrow swore under his breath. So the extra strike wasn't a malfunction. No, Poirot said. It was an instruction. Harrow leaned back slightly on the ladder. You're saying this clock was set up to do that on purpose? Yes. Why 13? Poirot opened his eyes. Because 12 ends something, 13 begins something else. Harrow looked down at the room below. The guests watching with a mixture of fascination and dread, the body now respectfully covered, the holiday decorations suddenly grotesque in their cheer. You think it was meant as a warning? Yes, Poirot said. But not a vague one. A precise one. Harrow turned back to the mechanism. This secondary system. What does it do exactly? Poirot pointed delicately. It counts. Harrow frowned. Counts what? Intervals, Poirot replied. Not hours, conditions. He gestured toward the hidden gears. This device does not respond to the hands on the face. It responds to motion inside the house. Weight on the staircase, pressure on the floorboards, perhaps even sound. Harrow's jaw tightened. So, when enough people gathered. The clock was triggered, Poirot finished. Silence fell as the implication settled. You're telling me, Harrow said slowly, that the clock wasn't just telling time, it was watching the room. Poirot nodded, and responding. Harrow climbed down the ladder with care, landing heavily on the polished floor. That means whoever set this up knew exactly where people would stand, when they would gather, how the night would unfold. Yes, Poirot agreed. This was choreography. Harrow ran a hand through his hair. So the 13 strikes were meant to happen exactly when the host was on the stairs. Exactly, Poirot said. A spotlight without light. Harrow looked back up at the clock, and the poison. Poirot folded his hands. Time to coincide. The sound drew attention upward. The fall drew it downward in that moment. No one was watching closely enough to see what truly mattered. Harrow grimaced. Which was what? Poirot's gaze drifted briefly to the covered body. The transition, he said softly. From life to performance. Harrow stared at him. You think this was staged like a play? I think, Poirot replied, that the murderer wanted the house to participate. A murmur rose from the guests as Harrow turned back to them. Listen up, he said sharply. This clock was altered, deliberately. Recently, someone in this house knows how it works, and why. Lydia Grafton spoke at once. My brother paid for the specialist. Yes, Harrow said, but specialists don't install secret triggers for free. The caretaker, Finch, looked ill. I never saw that second bit, he said quickly. Never. Poirot believed him. Inspector, Poirot said quietly, may I add something? Harrow nodded. If 13 rang once, Poirot continued, it can ring again. A ripple of fear passed through the room. This clock, Poirot said, is not finished speaking. Harrow glanced back at the mechanism, then at the guests. You're saying whoever did this could trigger it again? Yes, Poirot replied, or has already set it to do so. Harrow swore softly. That means this isn't over. Poirot's eyes rested once more on the great clock face, smiling, gilded, deceitful. No, he said, it is merely between strikes. The clock resumed its steady ticking as though nothing had been disturbed. But now they knew. Rosevear House was not keeping time. It was setting it. And somewhere in that beautifully dressed lie of a mechanism, the next moment waited, heavy, deliberate, and very much on purpose. Chapter 5. The Poison That Didn't Taste Like Poison. The doctor arrived with the air of a man summoned to confirm what everyone already feared. Dr. Samuel Whitcomb was a neat, careful figure, grey-haired and mild, voiced, his black bag carried like a symbol rather than a solution. He knelt beside the covered body with professional gravity, while Detective Harrow stood nearby, arms folded, eyes sharp and unblinking. Poirot observed from a respectful distance death. He knew, often revealed itself most clearly, not through what it destroyed, but through what it left untouched. Whitcomb's examination was thorough, but unhurried. He checked the pupils, listened briefly with his stethoscope, pressed gently at the chest and wrists. At last he straightened with a small sigh. "At first glance," the doctor said, "it resembles a sudden cardiac event. No violence, no defensive injuries. But that is only an appearance. Certain poisons can force the heart into failure so cleanly it mimics nature." A murmur passed through the guests, relief for some, confusion for others. Harrow did not relax. "A healthy man," he said flatly. "Mid-50s, no known history." Whitcomb shook his head. "None that I'm aware of, but such things do happen, Inspector, especially under excitement or stress." Poirot's voice cut gently through the exchange. "May I?" Whitcomb glanced at him, recognition dawning. "Monsieur Poirot." Poirot inclined his head. "Doctor, you will permit me one observation?" "Of course." Poirot stepped closer to the body and crouched, lifting the corner of the cloth just enough to expose Grafton's face. His expression in death was oddly serene, less pain than astonishment, as though the body had obeyed an instruction it did not understand. Poirot leaned closer. "Inspector," he said quietly, "observe the lips." Harrow knelt beside him. "What about them? They are stained," Poirot replied, very slightly. Harrow frowned. "From the champagne?" "No," Poirot said. "Champagne does not do this." Whitcomb adjusted his glasses and leaned in. "It is faint," he admitted. "A discoloration, perhaps, from a sweet drink." Poirot finished softly. "One with spice. Sugar clings, alcohol masks, but bitterness lingers." Harrow straightened sharply. "You're saying poison?" "Yes," Poirot said calmly, "but not one that announces itself." Whitcomb hesitated. "If you suspect poison, I must insist." "Doctor," Poirot interrupted gently, "did the man struggle? Number, did he convulse? Number, did he show distress beyond surprise?" Whitcomb shook his head. "Number," Poirot nodded. "Then whatever entered his body did so politely." A servant stepped forward, one of many, all pale now. "We had champagne and punch, sir. Holiday punch," Mr. Grafton insisted. "Where?" Harrow demanded. "In the side salon," the servant replied. "Before midnight." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "May we see it?" The side salon had been quieter than the main hall, arranged for those who preferred conversation to spectacle. A large crystal bowl sat upon a table draped in red cloth. Its contents half gone cinnamon sticks floated at the surface. Orange peel clung to the rim. The scent was warm, inviting, and now faintly nauseating. Harrow sniffed. "Smells strong, strong enough," Poirot said, "to forgive many sins." He bent closer to the bowl, inhaling carefully. Then he moved to the row of glasses set neatly beside it. One of them stood apart, already returned to the tray, empty, wiped clean. Poirot picked it up delicately by the base. "Inspector," he said, "this glass." Harrow frowned. "What about it?" "It has been cleaned," Poirot replied, "but not washed." Harrow took it from him, sniffed the rim, and stiffened. "Almonds," he said quietly. Poirot nodded. "Bitter almonds." Whitcomb exhaled sharply. "Cyanide," he said, and his earlier certainty drained away. "Then my first impression was wrong. This was made to look like the heart simply stopped." "Yes," Poirot said, "or something closely related." Harrow's jaw tightened, but the doctor says it looked like a heart attack. "And it was," Poirot agreed. "Poison can be most effective when it persuades the body to betray itself." Whitcomb looked shaken, but there was no taste reaction, no gagging. Poirot smiled faintly. "That is the genius. Sugar, spice, warmth, alcohol. The poison did not taste like poison. Harrow turned back toward the hall. So someone laced the punch. Not the bow, Poirot corrected. The glass. Harrow blinked. Why not the bowl? Because that would be reckless, Poirot said, and this crime is not. He gestured toward the isolated glass. One serving, one moment. No collateral damage. Harrow looked thoughtful, which means someone knew exactly which glass he'd take. Yes, Poirot said, or ensured he took that one. Harrow's eyes lifted slowly. Someone who served him. Or, Poirot replied, someone who anticipated him. They returned to the hall. The guests watched in silence as Harrow held up the glass. This, he announced, is what killed your host. A gasp rippled through the room. Lydia Grafton pressed her lips together. Martin Hale swore softly. The woman with the gift box clutched it tighter. Poirot stepped forward. Alastair Grafton did not die because his heart failed, Poirot said calmly. His heart obeyed. The room stilled. This poison, Poirot continued, was not meant to shock. It was meant to schedule. Harrow turned to him sharply. Schedule? Yes, Poirot said. Administered minutes before midnight, delayed just enough to coincide with the clock's signal. Understanding dawned slowly across Harrow's face. The 13 strikes, he murmured. Were not a coincidence, Poirot finished. They were a cue. Harrow exhaled slowly. So while everyone was watching the clock, no one was watching the man, Poirot said. Whitcomb shook his head. It's monstrous. It is meticulous, Poirot replied, and that is far more dangerous. Harrow surveyed the guests again, his eyes harder now. Someone here poured that drink. Poirot nodded, and someone else ensured the clock would speak at the right moment. Harrow frowned. You're saying more than one person was involved. I am saying, Poirot replied gently, that this murder required cooperation, if not in action then in silence. The clock ticked overhead, serene, deceitful. Poirot glanced up at it once more, then at the glass in Harrow's hand. A knife is immediate, Poirot said softly. A gun is obvious, but poison is patient. This killer didn't stab the man. No, Poirot agreed. They scheduled him, and as the realization settled over Rosevear House, amid garlands, candles, and the scent of spiced punch gone sour, the guests understood something chilling and final. This was not a crime of rage. It was a crime of timing, and whoever had planned it had done so with the calm certainty that time itself would cooperate. Chapter 6, the basement tick, and the missing key. The library smelled of polish, old paper, and something faintly medicinal, like a place designed to reassure visitors that knowledge here was orderly, contained, and harmless. Floor to ceiling shelves curved along the walls in obedient symmetry, broken only by a massive fireplace and a portrait of Rosevear House's original owner, whose painted eyes followed the room with proprietary interest. Detective Harrow did not like libraries. They encouraged lies to feel intelligent. He paced slowly along the shelves, fingers brushing spines without reading titles, his gaze skimming the architecture instead of the books. Poirot stood near the center of the room, still as a chess piece, his eyes fixed on the far wall. The house keeps answering questions. Nobody's asked. Harrow muttered, "That's never a good sign." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "A house that anticipates curiosity," he said, "has often rehearsed concealment." Harrow stopped abruptly. "You feel it too," he said. "This room's wrong." Poirot gestured gently with his cane. "Observe the shelves, Inspector." Harrow followed the gesture. At first glance, the bookshelves appeared uniform oak, polished, evenly spaced, but one section near the back wall was too neat. The books aligned with excessive precision, their spines untouched by the subtle warping of age that marked the others. Harrow stepped closer and pressed against the shelf. It shifted, not dramatically, just enough. "Well," Harrow said softly, "would you look at that?" He pushed again. The shelf slid inward with a quiet, well-oiled whisper, revealing a narrow door set flush into the wall behind it. The craftsmanship was excellent, too excellent. The kind of work done by someone who wanted the door never to be noticed. Poirot nodded. A secret should never look improvised. Harrow reached for the handle locked. Key? Harrow asked, without turning. The caretaker, Edgar Finch, hovered near the doorway, pale and sweating despite the cool air. I don't recall there being a door there, sir. Harrow finally looked at him. Finch swallowed. Must have been put in by the previous owner. Funny, Harrow said mildly. You said you've been caretaker here 12 years. Yes, sir. And you never noticed a hidden basement door behind a false shelf? Finch's gaze dropped. Poirot spoke gently. Mr. Finch, may I ask you something? Finch nodded quickly. When one cannot find a key, Poirot said, where does one usually look? Finch hesitated. In the pocket, Poirot finished. Harrow's eyes flicked downward. Finch's coat pocket bulged unmistakably with something angular and metallic. Silence fell. Harrow stepped forward and held out his hand. Give it. Finch hesitated only a second too long. Harrow reached in himself and withdrew a heavy iron key, old and well used. Harrow smiled once. It was not a pleasant smile. That, he said quietly, is the smile I wear when someone's story just broke. Finch sagged. I was told not to give it to anyone. By whom? Harrow asked. Finch swallowed. Mr. Grafton. Poirot nodded slowly. Of course. Harrow unlocked the door. The stairs beyond descended steeply, narrow and utilitarian, nothing like the mansion's polished grandeur. The air that rose from below was cooler and vibrated faintly like something mechanical struggling to be quiet. Tick, tick, not the stately beat of a grandfather clock. Something faster, more nervous. Poirot paused at the threshold, listening. There, he murmured, the second voice. Harrow gestured for Finch to go first. Finch complied reluctantly, his footsteps echoing too loudly in the confined space. Harrow and Poirot followed. The basement was smaller than expected, but crowded with intention. At its center stood a crude but ingenious construction, a secondary pendulum rig, mounted on a metal frame, its movement rapid and restless, humming faintly like a trapped insect. The pendulum swung in short, aggressive arcs, driving a series of gears that fed into a pulley system. Poirot leaned closer. Industrial parts, he observed. Recent manufacture, not decorative. Harrow traced the path of the mechanism with his eyes, and that wire. A thin cable ran from the rig upward, disappearing into the ceiling through a carefully drilled hole. Up to the clock, Harrow said. Yes, Poirot replied. A puppet string. Harrow crouched and examined the base of the rig. This thing isn't keeping time. No, Poirot agreed. It is measuring readiness. Readiness for what? Poirot straightened. For attention. He gestured upward. When the staircase filled, when weight and sound crossed a threshold, when the house reached a particular state of anticipation. Harrow let out a low whistle. So this thing waited until enough people were gathered, then told the clock to speak. Yes, Poirot said, and to speak incorrectly. Harrow stood, jaw tight. That means someone was down here earlier. Yes, Poirot replied, and someone ensured the door would not be opened. Harrow turned slowly to Finch. You knew about this. Finch shook his head frantically. Not like this. I knew there was. Equipment. I carried parts down when Mr. Grafton told me to. He said it was security. I never understood what it would fait au fait. Poirot regarded him kindly. Security, he said, is the most flexible word in any language. Harrow bent and inspected the pendulum again. This thing could be adjusted. Yes, Poirot said, calibrated. To ring 13, Harrow muttered. And to do so, Poirot added, only once unless reset. Harrow looked up sharply. Unless reset. Poirot nodded, meaning the person who built this had the option to repeat the message. Harrow straightened fully now, the implications clicking into place. So the clock wasn't just marking death. No, Poirot said softly. It was announcing control. They stood in silence for a moment, the basement ticking, filling the space between them. This wasn't just murder, Harrow said. This was theatre. Yes, Poirot agreed, with a hidden orchestra. Harrow turned back toward the stairs, which means the killer, or someone close to them, has technical knowledge, access, and enough confidence to hide all this in plain sight. Poirot inclined his head, and enough patience to wait. Harrow smiled again, briefly, sharply. Good, he said, because patience cuts both ways. He gestured toward the stairs. Let's go upstairs. I think it's time to ask some questions that people won't enjoy answering. Poirot followed him upward, listening as the basement tick faded behind them. The house above was quiet now, tense with the knowledge that something fundamental had shifted. Rosevear House had been revealed, not as a place of celebration, but as a machine, one that had been wound carefully, deliberately, and without mercy. And machines, Poirot reflected, always betray the hands that built them. Because no matter how clever the design, someone must always turn the key. Chapter 7. The Gift Box. That wasn't a gift. The quiet guest had been overlooked for too long. Poirot realized this as he watched her from the corner of the drawing room, where the remaining guests had been gathered under Harrow's watchful authority. She had not protested. She had not argued. She had not attempted to explain herself into innocence. She had simply remained where she was placed, the small silver gift box still held in both hands, as though it were an anchor. People who cling to objects, Poirot knew, are rarely attached to the object itself. They are attached to what it prevents. Miss, Harrow said at last, breaking the low murmur of tension, you've been carrying that box like it's the last solid thing in the world. I think it's time we see what's inside. Her fingers tightened reflexively around the ribbon. Poirot stepped forward, his voice gentle. You were honest earlier, he said. Honesty has momentum. It is easier to continue than to stop. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her expression shifted, resolve, perhaps, or exhaustion. All right, she said quietly. She placed the box on the table between them. The silver paper was immaculate, the bow tied with careful symmetry. It was the kind of wrapping one associates with affection, with anticipation. The room watched in silence as she untied the ribbon with fingers that trembled only slightly now. Inside, there was no watch. There was paper, not a letter, not a card, but a torn page, creased, worn thin by handling, its edges jagged as though ripped from a larger whole. It was covered in tight, slanted handwriting, interrupted by columns of numbers. Poirot leaned closer. Names, amounts, dates. Harrow frowned. What am I looking at? A record, Poirot said softly. Not of gifts. Of debts. The woman nodded. Payments. Harrow picked up the page carefully. From Grafton. Yes, she replied. From Alastair Grafton. Poirot studied the writing. It was precise, methodical, the handwriting of a man who believed order could substitute for morality. Who are these people? Harrow asked. People he ruined, she said, and paid. A murmur rippled through the room. Celeste Grafton, still pale in her black velvet, stared at the list as though seeing her marriage itemized in numbers. Poirot looked at her steadily. And the dead worker. Her jaw tightened. Thomas Bell. Poirot nodded. The name settled into place. Construction accident, she continued. 15 years ago, Grafton's development project. Safety complaints ignored. Reports falsified. Bell fell. They called it negligence. Harrow's expression hardened. And the payments. Hush money, she said simply. To his widow, to his brother, to anyone who might ask the wrong questions. Poirot traced the dates with his eyes. Monthly, he murmured. Regular, predictable. Yes, she said, until they stopped. Silence followed. When? Harrow asked. This autumn, she replied. Just before the holidays. Poirot looked up, and what reason was given? She let out a short, humorless laugh. None, just a letter polite, final. He said the arrangement had run its course. Harrow swore under his breath. Poirot folded his hands. Money, he said gently, is often used as a substitute for atonement. It is cheaper than remorse. The woman nodded. It kept people quiet. It kept grief contained, or so he thought. Harrow tapped the paper. And you. She met his gaze. Thomas Bell was my brother. The words landed with quiet finality. I worked here, she continued, years ago. Before the house was fashionable again, I watched Grafton smile at charity dinners while my family learned to live with absence. Poirot studied her face. There was anger there. Yes, but also something older, heavier. And the box? Poirot asked. She looked down at it. He asked me to bring him a gift, said he wanted something meaningful this year. Harrow frowned. So you planned to confront him? Poirot's voice was calm. But you did not poison him. No, she said firmly. I wanted him exposed, not dead. Poirot believed her. Harrow leaned back slightly, the pieces beginning to arrange themselves in his mind. So the payments stop, old wounds reopen, and suddenly, a Christmas party. A tradition, Poirot said quietly. Harrow looked at him. You think this night was chosen for a reason? Yes, Poirot replied. Traditions create expectation. Expectation creates permission. He gestured around the room. People forgive strange behavior on holidays. They accept drama. They excuse excess. Harrow nodded slowly. Revenge dressed as tradition. Poirot turned back to the woman. Who else knew about the payments? She hesitated. More than you'd think. Once you start paying people to be silent, you create a community. Poirot's eyes sharpened. A community bound by grievance. Yes. Harrow exhaled. So this wasn't just about one death. No, Poirot said. It was about many. He turned toward the gathered guests. Alastair Grafton believed he could control the past with money. He believed silence could be purchased indefinitely. Poirot paused. But silence, he continued, is not forgetfulness. The woman's voice was low. When the money stopped, the grief came back. Poirot nodded. Grief is patient. Harrow looked at the page again. This list, some of these names are here tonight. A ripple of tension ran through the room. Poirot allowed it. This was not a random guest list, Poirot said. It was curated. Harrow's eyes widened slightly. You're saying Grafton invited them? Yes, Poirot replied, or allowed himself to be surrounded by them. Why would he do that? Harrow asked. Poirot's expression was thoughtful. Because guilt often masquerades as generosity, and because he believed proximity equaled control. Harrow looked at the woman again. Did you tell anyone else what you planned to show him? She shook her head. Number. But others knew the payments had stopped, Poirot said. Yes, and others, Poirot continued, had more reason to seek finality rather than exposure. Harrow let out a slow breath. So this wasn't spontaneous. No, Poirot said. It was inevitable. He glanced briefly at the clock, then back to the torn page. This gift, Poirot said softly, was never meant to be opened. The woman nodded. It was meant to be seen. Harrow folded the page carefully and placed it back in the box. This changes things. Yes, Poirot agreed. It gives the crime a spine. Harrow looked around the room again, at faces now stripped of polite confusion, revealing fear, recognition, and something dangerously close to relief. Summon in here, Harrow said, decided exposure wasn't enough. Poirot nodded, and decided that tradition, the clock, the party, the midnight ritual, would make the message unavoidable. Harrow's jaw tightened. A warning. A conclusion, Poirot corrected, wrapped in tinsel. The woman closed the box and stepped back from the table, as though relieved of its weight at last. I didn't kill him, she said quietly. But I understand why someone did. Poirot regarded her with calm sympathy. Understanding is not the same as guilt. Harrow looked between them. But it does tell us where to look. He turned back toward the others. Ladies and gentlemen, Harrow said, his voice steady and cold. This wasn't an accident. And it wasn't random. This was a reckoning. Poirot folded his hands behind his back. And reckonings, he said softly, are never the work of chance. They are the work of memory, given structure. The gift box sat closed on the table now, no longer a promise, no longer a disguise. Just evidence, and as the truth took shape in the room, revenge dressed as tradition, grief wearing holiday wrapping. Poirot knew they were very close to the moment when politeness would finally fail, when the teeth behind the smiles would bite Chapter 8. The 13th strike test. Harrow waited until the house had gone completely still, not the forced stillness of fear, but the deeper kind, the kind that settles when people realize movement will only make them more visible. The servants had been dismissed to the kitchen. The remaining guests were assembled once more in the great hall beneath the clock, their holiday finery now rumpled, their expressions stripped of ceremony. Poirot stood slightly apart, his posture relaxed, his eyes alert. He had learned long ago that the most important moment in any investigation was the one where nothing appeared to be happening. Harrow cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily beneath the vaulted ceiling, "we are going to test the clock." The effect was immediate. A ripple passed through the group. Not a sound, but a reaction. Shoulders stiffened, breath caught. One woman clasped her hands together as though in prayer. A man near the fireplace took an involuntary step backward, then stopped himself. Poirot saw it all, and he saw too the one reaction that did not belong: panic. Not loud, not dramatic, just a sharp, involuntary flash. Eyes widening, pupils dilating, fingers curling as though to grasp something that was no longer there. It vanished almost at once, replaced by composure, but it had been real. Poirot filed it away. Harrow continued as though nothing had happened. "We know the clock was altered. We know it struck 13 once, and we know there is a hidden mechanism that allowed it to do so." He gestured upward with his chin. "We are going to see if it can do it again." A murmur broke out at once. "You can't be serious." "What if it triggers something else? This is absurd." Harrow raised his hand. "Quiet." The room obeyed. Poirot stepped forward slightly. "Inspector," he said mildly, "perhaps you will explain the purpose of this test." Harrow glanced at him, gladly. He turned back to the guests. "If the clock strikes 13 again, it tells us the mechanism is untouched. If it doesn't, well, that tells us something else." "And what would that be?" Lydia Grafton asked coolly. "That someone interfered with it," Harrow replied. "After the murder." A silence followed, heavier than any protest. Poirot nodded slowly. "Which would require knowledge," he added, "knowledge that the clock would attempt a second 13th strike." Harrow checked his watch. "It's nearly the quarter hour." He motioned to a constable stationed near the staircase. "Stand by the clock. Don't touch it. Just observe." The constable nodded, visibly tense. Poirot watched the guests now with renewed focus. This was the moment when masks slipped, not entirely, not for long, but just enough. The woman with the gift box closed her eyes briefly. Martin Hale stared fixedly at the floor. Lydia Grafton lifted her chin, her expression controlled. Edgar Finch wrung his hands unconsciously, then forced them still. And one person, Poirot did not look at them directly, shifted their weight as though preparing for disappointment. Poirot felt Hastings, who had remained mercifully silent, lean closer. "Poirot," Hastings whispered, "do you really think?" "Yes," Poirot replied softly. "I do." The minute hand crept toward the mark. Harrow raised his voice. "All right, watch closely." The first chime rang out. One, then two. The sound was clean, correct, reassuring in its familiarity. Several guests exhaled without realizing they had been holding their breath. 3, 4, 5. Poirot's eyes never left the faces. 6, 7, 8. At 9, someone swallowed audibly. 10, 11. Poirot felt the tension peak, taut as wire. 12. The final, expected chime echoed through the hall and faded. A collective breath surged outward. Relief, confusion, uncertainty. And then, nothing. The clock hesitated. The pause stretched, unnatural, expectant. Poirot's heart did not quicken. He had been waiting for this. The mechanism inside the clock strained audibly now, a faint metallic protest, a choking rasp beneath the casing. The pendulum faltered, the chime assembly shuddered, the 13th strike tried to come, and failed. The sound that emerged was not a chime at all, but a dull, strangled clunk, unfinished, embarrassed wrong. Then silence. The room erupted. What was that? It tried to. Did you hear? Something's broken. Harrow raised his hand again. Enough. Poirot stepped forward. The clock, he said calmly, remembered what it was meant to do. He looked up at the great face, now motionless, its gilded numerals suddenly ridiculous. But it could not complete the instruction. Harrow turned slowly to the group, because the hidden mechanism was tampered with. A murmur rippled through the room, sharper now, edged with accusation. Poirot's voice cut through it. Summoner went to the basement after the murder. Several heads turned instinctively toward Edgar Finch. Finch shook his head frantically. I didn't, I swear. I believe you, Poirot said gently. You would not know what to change. Harrow nodded. This wasn't random damage. Something specific was disabled. Poirot continued. The person knew the clock would attempt to strike 13 again, knew it would expose the mechanism, and so they intervened. He paused deliberately. Only the killer, Poirot said, would know it needed fixing. Silence fell again, this time sharper, more brittle. Harrow's gaze swept the room. Someone here returned to the basement after midnight. No, Poirot corrected softly. After death. He turned slightly, allowing his eyes at last to settle on the face he had been avoiding, the face that had panicked. Poirot did not accuse yet. Accusation without inevitability was mere noise. Inspector, Poirot said, may I make an observation? Harrow nodded. The clock was designed to speak once, Poirot said. To announce a message delivered does not need repetition, unless the speaker fears being misunderstood. Harrow's expression darkened, or discovered. Yes, Poirot agreed. Or both. The clock above them ticked weakly now, its confidence gone, its deception exposed. Poirot folded his hands behind his back. The 13th strike, he said quietly, was never meant to be a mystery. He looked around the room. It was meant to be final. Harrow drew a slow breath. And someone decided that wasn't enough. Poirot nodded. Which tells us something very important. What's that? Harrow asked. That this murder, Poirot said, was not only about ending a life. He paused, letting the words settle. It was about controlling the story afterward. The implication landed heavily. Harrow straightened. All right, he said. Now we're done waiting. Poirot inclined his head. Indeed. The test was complete. The clock had spoken. Once truthfully, once unsuccessfully, and in that failure, it had betrayed the hand that tried to silence it. Poirot looked again at the faces beneath it, no longer polite, no longer composed. One of them, he knew, had heard the clock choke, and had felt relief instead of fear. And that, Poirot reflected, was the sound of guilt trying very hard not to ring again. Chapter 9. The killer with 2 alibis. Harrow let the silence stretch until it grew uncomfortable. It was a deliberate cruelty, but a useful one. People filled silence with truth, far more readily than they did noise. The great hall seemed to shrink inward as the guests stood beneath the disgraced clock, its face now an object of quiet accusation rather than celebration. All right, Harrow said at last. We're going to talk about alibis. A collective tightening passed through the room. Specifically, Harrow continued, the kind that come in pairs. He turned toward Martin Hale, the business partner, who stood with his hands clasped loosely before him, posture relaxed, expression politely attentive. Mr. Hale, Harrow said, you told me that at the time of the collapse, you were in the kitchen. Hale nodded smoothly. That's correct. I'd stepped away for a moment, needed water, too much punch. And you, Harrow said, turning to the caretaker, confirmed that. Edgar Finch swallowed. Yes, sir. Mr. Hale was there. We spoke. Poirot watched Finch closely, The man's fear was genuine, but fear, Poirot knew, did not always indicate guilt. Sometimes it indicated proximity. Harrow folded his arms. "It's funny," he said mildly. "Two alibis ought to make a story stronger." He paused. "They usually don't." Hale's smile thinned slightly. "I don't follow." Poirot stepped forward, his voice calm, almost conversational. "Two alibis," Poirot said, "often indicate not corroboration, but coordination." Hale turned his gaze toward Poirot, eyes sharp now. "Are you accusing me of something, monsieur?" Poirot inclined his head. "Not yet." Harrow reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the heavy iron key that had been taken from Finch earlier. "Mr. Finch," Harrow said, "you told us this was a maintenance key." "Yes, sir." Harrow walked to a small side table and set the key down with a deliberate clink. "Funny thing is, we tried it." Finch's face drained of color. "It doesn't fit any household door," Harrow continued. "Not the library, not the cellar, not the wine storage." He paused. "But it fits the basement rig perfectly." A ripple of shock moved through the room. Finch shook his head violently. I didn't know that. Mr. Grafton gave it to me, said it was for maintenance." Poirot nodded. "Which is true," he said gently. "Just not the kind of maintenance you believed." Harrow turned back to Hale. "Now let's talk about you." Hale's jaw tightened. "I've already told you." "Yes," Harrow interrupted. "And now I'm going to tell you something." He stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly. "When you brushed past me earlier, I noticed your cuff." Hale glanced down involuntarily. "It smells," Harrow said, "like machine oil." A murmur spread. "Not mulled wine," Harrow went on. "Not spiced punch. Machine oil fresh." Hale laughed sharply. "This is absurd." Poirot raised a finger slightly. "On the contrary," he said, "it is precise." Poirot moved closer to Hale now, his gaze steady. "The basement rig," Poirot continued, "was recently adjusted. Someone recalibrated the secondary pendulum after the murder. Someone who understood mechanics." He paused. "Someone who feared the clock might speak again." Hale's eyes flicked toward the clock before he could stop himself. Poirot saw it. "And someone," Poirot added softly, "who could not rely on the caretaker alone." Hale straightened. "You're constructing fantasies." "No," Poirot replied. "We are dismantling one." Harrow gestured toward Finch. "Mr. Finch here had the key access, but not the knowledge." Poirot nodded. "He was useful, not essential." Harrow turned back to Hale. "You, on the other hand, had motive, access, and understanding." Hale scoffed. "Motive?" "Because I worked with the man," Poirot answered him. "Because when the payment stopped, Monsieur, your silence was no longer profitable." Hale's smile vanished entirely now. "You knew," Poirot continued, "that exposure would destroy reputations, including your own, but death ends negotiations." Harrow took over. "You didn't poison him alone." "No," Poirot agreed. "This was a duet. The other handled the mechanism, the staging, the coordination." Hale's voice was sharp. "You have no proof." Poirot's expression was almost regretful. "Ah," he said softly, "but we do." He turned slightly. "Inspector." Harrow nodded and produced a small cloth bag. From it, he removed the cleaned glass from the punch table. "This," Harrow said, "still smelled faintly of bitter almonds, but it also smelled of oil." Hale stared. "Simone handled it after poisoning it," Harrow continued. "Simone, who had just come from the basement," Poirot added quietly. "Someone who wiped it clean to remove prints, but not scent." Hale's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. "And finally," Poirot said, "your alibi." He held Hale's gaze. "You said you were in the kitchen when the clock struck 13. "Yes," Hale said hoarsely. "But the clock," Poirot continued, "was triggered by the basement rig, which means the person who adjusted it knew exactly when that strike would occur." Harrow finished the thought. "Meaning you didn't hear it as a surprise." Silence crashed down. Finch broke first. "He told me to say he was with me," Finch blurted. "Said it would keep us both safe." Hale closed his eyes. Poirot spoke gently now, almost kindly. "You did not kill Alistair Grafton in anger," Poirot said. "You killed him with rehearsal." Hale opened his eyes again, and for the first time, they were tired. "We timed it," he said quietly. "The drink, the clock, the fall, like theatre." Poirot nodded. "Yes." "You think that makes it worse?" Hale asked bitterly. Poirot met his gaze. "Number, I think it makes it clearer." Harrow stepped forward, cuffs ready. "Martin Hale, you're under arrest." Hale did not resist. As Harrow led him away, Poirot looked once more at the clock. Silent now, exposed, incapable of further lies. "A killer with 2 alibis," Poirot said softly, "is rarely twice as safe." He turned back to the room. "Usually," he concluded, "he is simply standing in 2 places where he should never have been at all." Chapter 10. When the clock finally tells the truth, the mansion had never been so quiet. Rosevear House, which only hours earlier had thrummed with music, laughter, and the confident noise of celebration, now seemed to hold its breath. Even the chandeliers appeared subdued. Their light softened as though unwilling to draw attention to itself. The great clock above the staircase stood silent, its gilded face no longer smiling, its authority stripped away. Time, for once, was listening. Detective Harrow stood at the center of the hall, his coat unbuttoned now, his notebook closed. He did not need it anymore. Everything that mattered had already arranged itself in his mind, sharp and unavoidable. The guests were gathered one last time. They did not cluster now. They stood apart, each person occupying a small island of space, as though proximity itself had become dangerous. The caretaker, Edgar Finch, looked shrunken, his hands clasped tightly before him. Lydia Grafton stood rigid, chin lifted, her grief now settled into something colder and more permanent. The woman with the gift box, now empty, its purpose fulfilled, watched the floor, her shoulders sagging with a fatigue that had nothing to do with the night. And Hercule Poirot stood slightly to one side, hands folded, his expression composed, attentive, almost gentle. Harrow cleared his throat. "All right," he said. "This is how it happened." No one interrupted him. "Alistair Grafton was poisoned," Harrow continued, his voice steady. "Not violently, not visibly. The poison was mixed into a spiced holiday punch, strong enough to mask bitterness, sweet enough to delay suspicion." He gestured toward the side salon. The bowl was clean. The poison was never meant for everyone, only for him. Poirot nodded once approvingly. "The glass was prepared in advance," Harrow went on, handled carefully, "swapped at the right moment, close enough to the punch table that it looked like ordinary service, not intent. And when Grafton drank from it, the clock had already begun its work." Harrow lifted his gaze to the great timepiece above them. "The 13th strike," he said. "That wasn't superstition. It wasn't a malfunction. It was a signal." Poirot stepped forward. Then, his voice calm but resonant. "A signature," Poirot said softly. "Stamped not in ink but in sound." Harrow nodded. The hidden clock rig in the basement, built quietly, carefully, was designed to trigger that extra strike only when the room reached a specific state. He paused, letting the implication settle. When enough people had gathered, when attention was fixed upward, when surprise would fracture observation. Poirot continued seamlessly. At the precise moment when Alistair Grafton's body betrayed him. Harrow turned slightly, his gaze resting on Edgar Finch. "The caretaker assembled the mechanism," Harrow said. "Not out of malice, but obedience. He was told it was security, maintenance, a favor. He followed instructions, supplied access, and never understood the purpose until it was too late." Finch's shoulders sagged. "I didn't know what it was for," he whispered. "I believe you," Harrow replied. "You built the stage, not the play." Poirot inclined his head gently toward Finch. "And stages," he said, Do not choose the ending. Harrow's attention shifted to the space now occupied only moments ago by Martin Hale. The business partner paid for it, Harrow said, planned it, rehearsed it. He knew the room, knew the people, knew exactly where eyes would go when the clock spoke. Poirot added quietly, he understood theatre. Yes, Harrow said, and he understood timing. Harrow took a breath. The poison was scheduled, he said, timed so that its effect coincided with the 13th strike. When the sound rang out, attention went up. When the body fell, attention went down. In that gap, those few seconds, no one was watching closely enough to see the truth. Poirot's eyes moved briefly across the guests. That, Poirot said, is how one kills in a crowded room. Silence followed, and when the murder was done, Harrow continued, the killer returned to the basement not to celebrate, to adjust, to make sure the clock wouldn't betray him again. Poirot nodded. Fear, he said gently, is a diligent engineer. Harrow allowed himself a short, grim smile, but not a perfect one. He gestured toward the staircase. The clock tried to strike 13 again, and failed because someone had tampered with it. Poirot looked up at the clock, his expression thoughtful. Machines, he said, resent being silenced. Harrow turned back to the guests. 13, he said, was never about luck, or curses, or superstition. He paused. It was a message. Poirot finished it. A riddle. Yes, Harrow agreed. A declaration, an announcement that what happened here was not an accident, not a loss of control. He glanced briefly toward the door, where Martin Hale had been led away in cuffs. It was intention. The weight of it settled fully now. Lydia Grafton spoke, her voice quiet. So he planned to die. Like that? Poirot turned to her gently. No, madam, your brother planned to live with impunity, Harrow added. And someone else decided the schedule had run out. The woman with the gift box looked up at last. He ruined lives, she said softly. Poirot met her gaze with compassion. Yes, he said, and someone decided to make the ruin symmetrical. The front doors opened then, letting in a draft of cold night air and the sound of approaching footsteps. Uniformed officers entered, efficient and restrained. Edgar Finch was led away first, pale but resigned. Then Lydia Grafton was escorted aside to give her statement. The house emptied slowly, as though reluctant to release what it had contained. At last, only Harrow and Poirot remained beneath the clock. Harrow looked around the hall, now stripped of voices. Funny, he said. Feels different without people. Poirot nodded. Houses, he said, are very much like clocks. Harrow raised an eyebrow. They only seem alive when something moves inside them, Poirot continued. When that motion stops, what remains is structure and memory. Harrow looked up at the clock once more. We'll have it removed. Yes, Poirot agreed. It has told all it knows. The clock face stared back at them, silent now, honest at last. Outside, police lights flashed briefly, then faded as the cars departed down the hill. Rosevear House stood alone again, its windows glowing faintly against the winter dark. But the glow was different now. Quieter, less certain, as if the mansion itself had learned to be afraid of time. Harrow extended his hand. You ever get tired of being right, Poirot? Poirot took it, smiling faintly. No, my friend, but I do get tired of what is required to be right. Harrow nodded, understanding more than he said. They walked toward the door together. As Poirot crossed the threshold, he paused and glanced back one final time at the great hall. The clock did not tick. It did not chime. It did nothing at all. And in that stillness, Poirot reflected that truth, like time, cannot be manipulated forever. It may be delayed. It may be disguised. It may even be made to strike falsely once or twice. But eventually, it tells the truth. And when it does, even the grandest mansion learns how small it really is.